Good morning.
Morning, George. Morning, Stan.
The site has been known for many decades by local people. People were collecting artefacts from this area, in fact, when that used to be the common practice of the day, from sort of the later 19th into the 20th century. But in terms of sort of serious archaeological investigation, Ethel Anderson in the 1970s was very interested in this site and could see that the erosion, which you can see now, was having a very substantial impact on archaeological features. So he undertook an excavation then, and at the time there were very high pine trees, so he was only able to excavate in between these trees, and he got substantial information then on the archaeological midden. That's an archaeological term, midden, that describes food refuse, and as in so many New Zealand archaeological sites, that's particularly shell and fish bone, but there's also other material up there as well. And Ethel described a site where there was a great deal of barracuda and red cod, the dominant fish species. He also identified the shellfish as primarily pipi and some cockle. The erosion had continued at the site, in fact had continued at a quite extraordinary rate since Ethel's work. So I applied for permission from the Pūrākaunui Block Inc and Historic Places Trust is required for permission to carry out a rescue excavation here. Perhaps the most exciting outcome of our work, however, was to find structural features. In other words, evidence that people had actually constructed some structures here. Ethel certainly found, as we did, evidence of umu, or underground fireplaces, so we knew people were here for at least some period of time. Ethel had suggested they were here relatively temporarily to catch fish, basically, as a fish processing place in the early period. Our investigation, however, determined that there were post holes, the remains of structures, and most interestingly, at least as far as I'm concerned, we found several pits of a reasonable size, about sort of 2 by 4 metres roughly, and these rectangular pits, they were associated with posts. There were posts around the edge of those pits, so they clearly had roofs. They were relatively deep, up to, you know, sort of some tens of centimetres, 50, 60 centimetres deep. And elsewhere in New Zealand, including northern and northeastern South Island, where these sorts of structures are found in dunes like this, they're always associated with sweet potato crop storage. One scenario could be perhaps that sweet potato was traded or exchanged down here, and that that sweet potato, the sweet potato pits may represent the storage of material that was exchanged from outside of the district. But there are microclimates certainly in North Otago and locally where people have been able to grow sweet potato. So another scenario, which I personally favour, is that the pits may represent a very early and effectively lost tradition of local sweet potato cultivation. It is interesting that we have, from this period of time, kumara storage pits, quite possibly. We also find, not a lot, it's not the dominant fish, but certainly we find some snapper here. Snapper do straggle down the east coast of the South Island, so maybe there's an indicator there that, as you say, things might have been a little warmer, and perhaps with warmer temperatures, the straggling of snapper might have been a more sort of prominent phenomenon. The southern limit may well have been extended not just for sweet potato, but perhaps also for snapper as well. And interestingly, as you look along the dunes, you see for some tens of metres a relatively homogeneous dark topsoil which is buried by unconsolidated dune, and that topsoil in places is 50, 60 centimetres deep. And again, I've excavated and investigated Māori agricultural sites from the 15th, 16th century in the northern South Island, in Golden Bay in particular, in similar dune situations, and those soils, the agricultural soils there, are identical to the soils that you see here. So personally, I think what we may have is evidence, and the first evidence, I might add, the first archaeological evidence that we can demonstrate of very early local sweet potato cultivation. We have radiocarbon dates from the site, so we know that these pits are about the 15th century. We know that because some of the shell remains you can see above us here spill out over onto and effectively cap the edges of the pit, so they post-date the construction of the pit, and the radiocarbon dates, as I say, consistently date that pit to 15th century. So this isn't a late potato storage pit, white potato storage pit. In our excavations, we did come across some artefacts. There were fish hooks, as we expected, with the evidence of fishing, but there was also a lot of stone material, some of which showed evidence probably of adze manufacture. There are adzes that have been, stone adzes that have been picked up from this locality over the years by individuals, some held in private collections, some, as I say, probably in the Otago Museum. And Māori exchanged important stone sources up and down the country. So you have, for example, metasomatized argillite from Nelson appearing in Otago sites. There's some silcrete, which probably came from central Otago, struck from a core into a sort of a blade form to be a tool, a cutting tool. The stone includes a variety of stone sources, including obsidian, which of course comes from the North Island, and that's very common, particularly in earlier sites.
Well, the beginning at Long Beach, of course, was for us when we were asked by the Historic Places Trust, Helen Leach and I, if we would do an excavation, and we knew that most of that flat, there's hectares of it. What is it, about 40 hectares? There had been sites there and people had found material. We really hadn't expected to find undisturbed material, and we did. We were so pleased. The area of the excavation was the 10 metres by 5 on this bit of a ridge here, though of course the site would have spread right along that ridge. It was apparent to us that in the very early period, we radiocarbon dated to the 13th, 15th, or 14th, 15th century. They'd been living on a nice sandy boulder beach. I mean, it wasn't just boulders. It was quite a good amount of sand. And that there was, to our surprise, sea right beside them. The sea at the moment is about 1 kilometre out, isn't it? Mm. And it's been steadily building up, presumably ever since that very early period. Why this area is so favourable for living in? Well, first of all, there would be the climate and the fact that it's so sheltered from the south that if you're caught in a nor'wester out in your boat, at least you're being blown back on shore. The rainfall is moderate and tends to be most of the year round, so that you're never in a stage where it's terribly dry. That meant that the vegetation grew well. That meant that your firewood supply was always good, because living a hunter-gatherer way of life is fine. You move from one place to another and you can get firewood. But if you're going to settle, if you're living in a solid permanent house, and you've got women and young children and so forth, you have to keep warm. And so a good supply of firewood, quick growth of Kānaka, for instance, that must have been a very important aspect of life in those early villages and early campsites. And then as far as the women and children were concerned, there was always shellfish on the beach. In the early stages that was mussel and pipi. In the later stage it was mud snail and cockles and some of those other ones. And there were always a few birds, and there was plenty of greens in the bush. If you've got good healthy bush, you can go in and nip, green. They must have done that. Otherwise, your vitamin C problems would have been considerable. And the men had plenty of occupation getting barracuda from those big shoals offshore. But it was very apparent from when we looked at the birds that there was a very nice forested environment. There was an enormous range of bird species. Just as in most of our Otago sites, they were taking very few of every species. They're all the sort of common bush birds and the penguins and ducks and shags and that sort of thing. And there was only a little moa bone in the lower layer. It was more what we call industrial moa bone. It looks as though they'd been somewhere where there was a moa hunter site and they brought a bit of bone back. We don't really know that they were eating moa. Yeah. Because the lower layers, they weren't very early. They're not. There's certainly there's tuatara in it, which is something you only find in early sites. And there were 6 tuatara of all sizes. So, Pūrākaunui is it's well justified in bringing tuatara back there. Yeah. There was the occasional pleasure, I suppose, of eating a young seal or sea lion, because even today they still try and come up on those shores. They ate quite a few dogs. Yes, the dogs were a source of food, but they were there for fishing, and it was mostly for barracuda. They were getting a few groper, which is something that's tended to go from our shores now. And both early and late, it was a fishing camp in the early period. You couldn't, grace us as anything more than that. But in the later period, because we found the remains of that house with solid slab posts, we said, they had a permanent house here, and this was a fishing village. This was a place where people stayed the year round. What we found were the post holes, or the slabs, of the bottoms of the posts of a house just here. There were 5 of them in a row about here, and the rest of the house would have been that away, but it had been completely dug through by curio hunters long before we arrived on the scene. But over beside the house here, there were layers of midden, and the upper layer, which would have been roughly contemporary with the house, was just a solid mass of barracuda heads lying with the bones still in articulation. I cannot imagine that they were completely contemporary with the house, and that is why I can envisage that the whole of this boulder ridge here was occupied over decades. And for 1 decade, the house might have been here, and just living areas and hangi and so forth around it, and then they shifted the house to over there, or they built another house over there, and then they decided they would use this area for processing their fish, and that would be where the rather smelly part of the midden would be. Perhaps a little bit further over there might have been racks for drying the flesh from the barracuda, because this was quite clearly a barracuda processing camp, both at the early period. Well, in the later period, it wasn't just a camp, it was a true village with permanent houses. And there may not have been many houses, but at least there was one here. Even at Shag River mouth, there were only round houses, which were of lighter sort of construction, I would have thought. Long Beach is the only one where that solid house has turned up. Yeah. It was the first time that we'd really been able to take a look at material that had been excavated from dated layers, and then we were able to tell that the artefacts that came out of it belonged to particular periods, went with particular ways of life, of gathering particular sorts of foods, and we knew therefore that these particular types of fish hooks and of amulets came from the later layer, and that another type, the one-piece fish hooks, came from a much earlier layer. We'd had our suspicions that Baroque fish hooks were classic. It was reasonably certain, but we didn't have the clear associations with radiocarbon dates and with other materials, and to know that yes, this type of amulet, which is commonly found with barbed fish hooks, yes, that turns up in a classic layer here, and whereas one-piece fish hooks and plainer ornaments turn up in the lower layer and associated with a few moa bone. It was that very clear provenancing of these vast collections that we have of unprovenance material in the museums that was the cultural significance of this particular excavation, and which pleased us to have this thing pinpointed and settled into place for once. There's quite a nice representative sample of the fish hooks from Long Beach here. There's both the very early ones, which were simple, and some of the later ones which had more elaboration on them. We begin here with the one-piece fish hook, which is fairly typical of the lower layers, and the fish hook is hitched to its piece of line there, and that is the point there. These other ones are points from composite fish hooks, and they range from simple points, just simple curves, through to much more complex ones. So that if we start with these, they just have a bit of a curve, a few bits of notches, and then here you see that the point, the actual bit of barb at the point, actually has a whole heap of little notches all along it. This is probably the largest artefact. Well, it is said to come from Long Beach, and certainly it is the largest lump of obsidian I've ever seen. It is far too big for one person to pick up. It must have been brought south from Mare Island in a canoe. We found quite a lot of small flakes of obsidian in our excavations at Long Beach. Both sorts, both green and black. Most of the green do come from Mare Island, and some of them probably may have even come off this particular block. That's D'Urville Island argillite. Beautiful stuff to make adzes from, and that is a gorgeous piece of material. But there's more of it, though, in a very different form. That's an archaic adze, that's early. This is a very simple, more what we call a 2B adze, and it's much more likely to be later.
This type of Pūrākaunui, I believe, is from Jackson's Bay area, which was quite close in terms of sailing around the bottom of the island, through Pūrākaunui up through Milford, up into that area. And these three hetiki, still quite recognisable as whakapapa stone. These little carving gouges and chisels. The same with the other Pūrākaunui, is identifiable mainly by the coloration and the higher amount of calcium and sodium. This is again typical whakapapa area stone. Some of the darker pieces, if we held that up to the light, you'd see they had a very high proportionate amount of iron. So for this piece, quite easily recognisable as getting up the top of the Dart River to Pūrākaunui, coming into these larger adzes, still recognisable as from whakapapa.
When I was at the harbour board, there was a pilot there by the name of John Haberfield. That ring a bell?
Yes.
He was around the slipway one day, put the pilot boat on the slip, and I was talking to him, and he found out where I lived, and he said, "Oh, I've got some of my great-grandfather's writings at home," and he said, "but they're all in Swedish or Danish, I just forget which." And he said, "I've kept them because I want to get them translated one day." But he said, now and again, you come across Pūrākaunui and Wellers that doesn't translate. So I said, "Oh, I'd be interested to see that." And he said, "I would think it would be in connection with the whaling station out your way." I said, "Good." He said he got some of it transcribed or translated, and he said no, some of them were just household accounts. But he said I won't bring the records in because they're like the chain Bibles of the Middle Ages. They're too precious to bring in. And he said, "I'll tell you now that one of them happened to be a dismissal from Weller's whaling station for insobriety." Because he was noted for that, wasn't he? And he said, "But the other one, I'll try and decipher it for you." So he brought it in, but I was away on holiday for a fortnight, and he shoved it under the winch house door. And when I got to it, it is water stained and what have you, but it was quite legible, and it was just instructions from Wellers, one of the Weller brothers, to set up a fishing station at the entrance, or where convenient, and set up the manager's house well away from the smell of blubber and all the rest of it. And he said that it must be on the seaward side of the land that runs across the inlet, halfway up the inlet. Well, see, that's here, and that's reading between the lines, that's where As You Like It is now, but As You Like It is not the original house. When you have a look at the architecture, it's no older than a lot of the old places around here, 1870, but it's on the site of. Because my father said his mother, Ellen Driver, said there was a slab hut there at one stage. So that must have been the original house. When my parents and I came here in 1946, Drivers had the section next door, and they had a potato patch in there that started in 1916. That was Arthur Driver, and they must have used what I call John Pūrākaunui potatoes, because they're a dark, they're a purple skin, quite white inside, and there was a pile of them. And as I say, in 1946, when my father went over there one day when we were cutting the whakapapa hedge on the boundary, and he came across this pile of potatoes that had grown and spread over the years, and he looked up and said, "Oh, they're still growing John Pūrākaunui potatoes." So we had some that night, but they weren't all that good. They turned to mush. If he's not known by anything else, he'll be known by his potatoes.
In 1975, the government of the day decided they'd do a nationwide coastal survey, and they did that. They came to this area, they found this paper road on this piece of paper, and they determined that that paper road was Crown land, and the accretion that attached to it was also Crown land. In the 1980s, I got to thinking about the relevance of the Raglan Golf Course decision, and so initially I went to the Māori Land Court and said we want an order saying that road was Māori land, and it was never been used for that and should be returned to Māori land. But the court was a bit nervous about upsetting the government of the day in that way, and he suggested that we go off to the Waitangi Tribunal, which we did. And then in due course the Waitangi Tribunal found in their favour. The land was vested in the incorporation, and in return, because recognising the changes that have occurred now, the incorporation gifted public access rights along the ocean beach and from the end of this legal road here. The Waitangi Tribunal application for the 37 hectares of accretion immediately behind the ocean beach, that was successful in the 1980s, but it tracked back much earlier than that. I'd initially applied to the Māori Land Court to have that land vested in the incorporation. And Sid Cormack, whom I had utmost respect for, was still alive at that time, and he came and mentored me at the Māori Land Court for a couple of hearings about that application. As I said before, the judge got nervous about telling the government that they'd done wrong, and suggested we go off to the Waitangi Tribunal, which we did, and we succeeded. They used to come out and get off the Pūrākaunui railway station, which was a mile along to the right, and they'd walk along the railway formation, carrying all their foodstuffs and gear for the stay, and then do likewise when the stay was over. Later on, in the 1940s, there was pressure came from these little settlements to have railway stops, stations put in here, and there was one created at Osborne Township just around the corner, and there was one here called the Gums. My maternal grandfather, Te Aki Mira, had 3 marriages. In 1857 he married Karini Te Kaukau, and there were no children from that marriage. Karini died, and in 1875 there was a short-term tragic marriage to Flora Tiramorahu from Moiraki, and that lasted only a month before Flora died. And then he married my maternal grandfather, Emma Stevens, and they lived their lives here. They had 12 children, 10 of whom grew to adulthood. The mother was one of the younger ones of that family. 3 of her brothers got caught up in that horrible First World War. Her brother Peter was killed at Passchendaele.
I can always remember my mother telling us that they had a letter from Peter, and he said something like, "It won't be long now before I'll be seeing you all, but it is raining here tonight, so who knows what may happen." And that night he was killed. Our mother was Sarah Matoitoi Miller. She was from a family of 9 brothers and sisters. She went to they all went to Pūrākaunui School, and my mother was dux of the school, and we were very proud of that. And then she went on to Te Waipunamu College in Christchurch, and came back and married my father, Robert John Francis McLaughlin.
3 of the McLaughlins married 3 of the Millers, and the McLaughlins came from Highland background where the tribal culture of communal mutual support and that was strong as it was in Māori. So they were quite successful marriages.
My 2 brothers were born out at my grandmother's place, and Mary McLaughlin, that's Auntie Elle's daughter, was a sister, in the hospital, and she was she delivered babies and that, so she delivered the 2 boys at Grandma's. But I went to Dunedin, so I was born in Dunedin. And my aunt and uncle, who had no family, Uncle George and Auntie Aggie, they lived on the cliffs up above Goto Island, and my eldest brother John wasn't allowed to go to school till he was 6 because he had terrible nosebleeds, and he used to go and stay with Auntie down at the cliffs, and from Monday till Friday, and then he would come home for the weekend.
My memories of staying here with my uncle and aunt were of the waves pounding on these foreshore rocks, and the double hung windows would shake and rattle, and of course just behind the house the railway cutting is, so when the trains went past you'd get a rumble from that too.
We had to walk to school 1 3/4 miles each way, and sometimes when we went to the point and the tide was out, we would take our shoes and socks off and walk across to the bottom of the school road where our grandmother lived, and we would take a towel with us and dry our feet and then put our shoes and socks on and hike up the road to school.
We walked to school and back again each day. It didn't do us any harm. There was a measure that we had, because in the morning there was a passenger train went past here at about 8:10, and we could gauge how far along the road or the bay we were as to whether we were on time or whether we had to speed it up a bit.